Ranching in a changing frontier. Cattle barons. After the Civil War, many people in Texas began ranching or raising cattle. These people, known as cattle barons, knew they could raise cows on the good Texas land. They also knew they could make a lot of money selling cows. They built large ranches on the Texas prairies. They hired men to take care of the cattle. These men were known as cowboys and wranglers. They worked on the ranches every day and took the cattle to be sold at market. The cattle barons used the money they had made to buy more cattle. They also made their ranches larger and better. The King Ranch in Kingsville, Texas has been around since Richard King started it in 1852. Today, this is the largest cattle ranch in the world. The ranch is larger than the state of Rhode Island. Life on a ranch. Most ranches in Texas were located on plains and prairies. Usually, there were no neighbors for many miles around. Until the 1880s, ranchers kept their cattle on the grassy plains or the open range. These ranches had enough food and supplies to last for up to a year at a time. They got water from windmills that pumped water from underground wells. Most ranchers had several buildings. The ranch owner usually lived in the main house. Cowboys, wranglers, and ranch cooks usually lived in a nearby bunkhouse. The owner might build different sized buildings or fences depending on the climate and the ranch's size. Cowboys. The work done by cowboys on the ranch was very hard. They were responsible for the daily jobs on the ranch. They also were responsible for getting the cattle ready to sell. The cowboys had to brand or mark each cow so they knew which ones were theirs. Many ranchers brought their cattle to the markets, and each rancher had his own brand design that they burned into the hides of each of his cows. The cowboys drove or guided the cattle to railroads. From there, the cattle would be taken to a market and sold. These trips were called cattle drives. They were often long, dusty, and dangerous journeys. Cowboys depended on their horses. These horses had to be hardworking and have great endurance. Cowboys trained their horses to keep the cattle moving along the trails safely. Texas trails. The trails of Texas were often very crowded. Sometimes the cattle even had a difficult time finding enough food on the trail. There were several trails that led from South Texas to the beef markets in Kansas, Missouri, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. The Chisholm Trail carried 2 million cattle to Kansas from 1867 to 1871. The Goodnight Loving Trail was established in 1866. Cattle on this trail were headed to Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. Trail drives. In order to make money, ranchers had to drive or guide the cattle down trails for hundreds and hundreds of miles. The trip was always hard work. It was sometimes boring. Many times it was dangerous. The cowboys rode near the herd of cows to keep them from wandering off. The men faced wild animals, harsh weather, and sometimes even angry American Indians. But there were two dangers that were always on the cowboys' minds. The first was running out of drinking water on the hot, dusty trail. The second was the chance of a stampede. The wild cattle might be easily scared. They might burst off running for miles. A cowboy caught in the middle of a stampede could easily be hurt or killed. Barbed wire. At the beginning of the cattle boom, ranchers let their cattle roam anywhere they wished. But farmers did not like that animals could wander onto their land. Soon, these farmers put up barbed wire fences. They wanted to be able to grow crops without wild, roaming animals destroying their fields or eating their crops. Ranchers could no longer let their cattle wander over the open range. The animals had to be kept in pens. Even though the new fencing cost money, it seemed to be a good idea. Ranchers were able to keep wild animals away from their herds. The health of all animals improved. The farmers' fencing, however, made it impossible to lead the cattle down the trails on drives. Ranchers now had to use nearby railroads to get their animals to market. The end of the trail. After only 20 years, the cattle driving business came to an end. Nobody wanted cowboys to cross their land with thousands of cattle. Many farmers and ranchers put up fences around their land to keep the cowboys away. American Indian tribes wanted to be paid for letting the cattle cross their lands. At the same time, many cattle on the trails caught a disease called Texas fever. The disease was quickly spreading between cattle on the trail. Many of them died. To keep this disease from spreading, many towns did not allow cattle to pass through. Soon, the price of beef dropped. Cattle barons were no longer making huge profits. The cattle driving business ended, but the trails left their mark on Texas and America. During those 2 decades, Texans built many new ranches. People also built many new towns along the trails. Many of these communities continued to grow. People began to think about using the railroads more to transport all kinds of goods. Although one period of history was ending, another exciting period was just beginning.